and how it's beginning to influence the world of wills and probate. Martin and I come at this from two slightly different perspectives. Martin has a legal background with a tech slant. I have a tech slant with no legal background at all, and I will introduce that in a second. But the point of today really is to just try and get some more specific examples of how technology is beginning to influence this particular space. Get some discussion going and share some thoughts that we have on what the future might look like. You will all have your own views. I'm keen to hear that as much as we can. So quick introduction to myself. I'm Nick. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Exozent. We are a relatively new entrant into the legal tech space. Our goal has been to look at how we can develop ultimately a bereavement platform for the UK, and obviously the role of the legal services world in how we help people manage and service estates is really critical. We're a huge supporter of professionals doing a great job in this space to help the bereaved people as they go through that process. So we're not going to talk too much about Exozent. I'll give a little bit more of an overview of that later. But I really started that company having spent 20 years working in the financial services world and seeing the impact that the role of financial services has on estate administration and on bereaved people, and also having gone through the process myself a couple of times, unfortunately, executing a will and dealing with bereavements across our family, and with friends of mine having lost parents and unfortunately partners really early in life, and just seeing them struggle through estate administration in particular. I was keen to see whether we could do something with some 21st century technology to try and make the world of bereavement administration a little bit easier. So we're on a bit of a journey, which we'll maybe touch on as we go through today to try and make that happen. And the legal services world is a really big and important part of our sort of customer base, as it were. So we've already got a bunch of people using our platform to help them run through estate administration cases with their clients. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So yeah, I'm not a lawyer. I come to this very much from a sort of consumer user perspective. But also knowing how, ultimately what benefits a good, well-designed platform can have on an industry. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I'm going to hand over to Martin just to talk about himself a little bit more, and then we'll get into this conversation.
Thank you very much, Nick. I almost feel like I need to apologise for being the lawyer in the room, but I am a lawyer. I've been a lawyer since 1995 when I qualified, having started at 1993. I got involved with probate disputes for 1 and 2. Didn't even have a name back in 1993. They were just people fighting about estates. So we got involved in that type of work back then. Continued to get involved in I suppose expanding that area of work in the time in between. Over the last 15 years, I've been doing nothing but dealing with problems and issues that arise after people have died. My background tends to be, even though I'm a lawyer, I was sort of a maths, physics, computer science, A-level student, so I was always a little bit of a techie kind of slant to it. So when I set my own firm up, IDR Law, back in 2017, decided that I would bring my kind of tech leaning into the practice, but also look at ways in which we could develop other things that weren't legal situations, that weren't legal solutions, but were actually more techie solutions to try and resolve some of the legal problems that we had. And we did that by setting up a sister company called Matrona Technologies, which basically turned into a sort of an R&D type vehicle for looking at ways in which we could plug any holes or problems that we came across in the day job, as it were. I've got a team now we started with me alone in 2017, and we've now got a team of 20. So to give you some idea of how much dispute work is actually out there and how the increases have been seen every year on year since that date. So I'm becoming more and more sort of leaning towards not just solving dispute work as it pops up, because I've got some great lawyers who sort that out, but also through the tech side of the business is looking at ways in which we can use tech to try and prevent the kind of cases and disputes that we are dealing with day to day. So whilst as Chris described, I am a lawyer, but I certainly have a very, very clear idea what I want in terms of tech to try and stop problems coming through. So that's where Nick and I sort of overlap, is that we've been interested in solving problems, and I like what he's doing at Event, and that provoked then a conversation, and here we are.
Perfect. Thanks, Martin. Unfortunately, we have a few people saying that your sound is a bit fuzzy. So it might be that we try switching back to your.
I'll do that while you're talking. Yep.
I will take the next bit of the conversation on while you do that. So sorry for the sound, guys. Martin is unfortunately having to stay clear of a COVID cases, so it's he's not with his usual tech setup at the moment. So just as we get into this, what I thought I'd do is just give a perspective on what I see as an important definition when it comes to the word platform. So we talk about platforms a lot. Lots of people use that phrase and throw it about the various sectors, but I thought it'd be useful just to set some context as to how I see technology and the way that we deploy things, and how we define what a platform is versus other types of tech. So we all deal with platforms all the time, right? Platforms are typically multi-sided, so that means they try and connect Could I just ask everyone to go on mute, please, if you can? There's a few.
Well, to be what they say, the earlier the better. So even if they say come in an hour, see if you can do that. What you want to do is make sure they've done what they can. When you go, it doesn't really matter, as long as they copy the setup.
Jess, could you maybe just mute everyone again, please?
From there, but they've done as what they can. Once they've done it, they're just going to leave it for you to sign it away.
I'll just give.
Hi, it's Lindsay. Everybody is on mute.
That'll be great. We will come before.
I think there we go. Well done. Thank you. Sorry about that. So yes, the word of platforms. We all engage with platforms every day. Those platforms are typically multi-sided. So what distinguishes a platform from a piece of software is ultimately its role is to connect people together who would ordinarily be using other routes. So if you think of all the things that we experience day to day, whether it's travel, whether it's shopping, whether it's entertainment, whether it's even the way we interact with government sometimes now, these are increasingly developed. These interactions are increasingly held on platforms, right? Which is the role is to connect different groups, 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, usually in a multi-sided nature. And the role is really to help make the friction that would typically exist between those groups disappear, or at least alleviate them as much as you can. And that's when the role of platform technology really starts to come into its own. So if you think of all the interactions you have when you're buying something, booking travel, what you used to have to do was to inconvenience yourself by going to meet someone, to arrange a meeting, to take documents, to do all these kind of things. And actually that's an increasingly rare thing that you have to do now. Sometimes you would do it out of choice, but more often than not, you're able to conduct those interactions using a multi-sided platform, right, which is connecting those 2 bits, allowing data exchange and removing friction. And those are pretty prevalent in everyday life these days. And I was really interested when I started looking at the world of bereavement as a wide concept, as to how little movement had really happened in the world of bereavement when it comes to platforms and connecting different groups of people together better. So when we talk about platforms, and that's kind of a theme for today, is really how do we help develop those kind of solutions in this market to solve problems, to remove friction, and ultimately make those processes easier for everyone. And what I find really fascinating about bereavement, and I'm sure Martin you'll concur with this, is just the sheer number of people involved. Right, cases are so complicated, they involve so many people. So wherever we can start to think about how we connect those people together better, there's real efficiency and advantage to be gained.
Entirely right, Nick. I think my experience of bereavement, both, and I've lost people like yourself, and also worked in the sector, is that the more we can actually take away the hassle and the difficult kind of administrative elements of that process, the more we're able to focus on the bits that actually we can make the biggest difference, which is looking after those individuals who are going through that process, giving them some space, get them to a stage where they can start dealing with their own grief and their own relationships. It's a very American phrase, I know, but finding closure very often doesn't happen until you've actually got through the administrative process of getting somebody's affairs sorted after death. And average lengths of time, you'll have all seen the stories on the news and certainly on LinkedIn if you act in the sector, is that the time it's taking to get people through that process is really, really difficult for people. And for me, anything that makes it easier so we can focus on the real important stuff has got to be a good idea. It's got to be a good idea.
And I'm always interested in hearing different people's perspectives on where frustration lies in the process. So we've spent a lot of time engaging with practitioners. We've spent a lot of time engaging with bereaved people who have lost somebody and are trying to go through this process. And we're increasingly spending a lot of time engaging with the financial services world, right? So that triangle of those three people coming together, you know, they're really the key actors in this space, putting aside government agency. So, you know, anything beginning with an H, which seems to be have a very active role in this space, which is they're on their own journey for that. But when we speak to those three groups, we often hear of really common sets of frustrations, and a lot of it comes down to inefficiency of the way that we handle data, the repetitive nature of the query processes that we're always being asked for, some of the challenges around identity and those kind of things, where we're actually in other spheres, we're all, you know, we're so far ahead of that when we think about how we interact with banks when we're alive, you know, just the ability to have digital identities and all these kind of things that just don't seem to exist in this space. And I'm interested in your thoughts really around what are the common areas of frustration that you see that feel like we should be able to do something?
Yeah, I think for me, none of what you described there is in a vacuum, of course, is that I come at it with a disputes background. So we see probably, over the last 10 years, it's increased from about 5% and it's rising, the number of estates that fall into dispute. So that's kind of the background I come into this administrative process, is that I'm already dealing with families who are in dispute. Very often, because they don't know what's in the estate or where it's going or how long it's going to take, is that families don't connect and they don't talk until that's been done, and that increases friction and the cause for problems. There's a couple of stats that came out last year now, but they're telling, you know, 1 in 3 people are now saying that they are not hoping or even expecting, but actually relying on an inheritance to either fund their retirement or pay off debts or mortgage. That's 1 in 3. So they're coming into that bereavement kind of set to that whole process, knowing that I'm absolutely relying on some element of this inheritance to be able to live. Very often they don't have a plan B. The windfall generation getting money now is more than ever before, and the stakes therefore go higher. 1 in 4 then say, if that doesn't actually happen, what I'm then going to have to do, because I don't have a plan B, is actually then to bring some form of claim against the estate. So you overlay that kind of scenario, that kind of surrounding set of facts into the administrative problems and the log jams, and you can see why tensions begin to rise. I think it's imperative that we actually get a slicker, quicker system. In terms of log jams themselves, it's actually getting valuations of estates all together. You described there how you're having to almost herd chickens to try and get everybody together to get proper valuations in place before you can then start to administer. So that does create a problem, because people come at it with different expectations of value. Families are more disparate. They're very often blended families now. So you've got stepchildren, stepfamilies. They don't know the finances very often of the person that's died as much as they may have done previously, where they knew there was one property, you know, one saving account, and then we're okay. People are far more sophisticated now. In particular, year on year or decade on decade, is more people are using digital savings, digital accounts, and this is spread across the board, so people don't know what's there, so they start to build up an expectation. Yeah. Everybody's worth more in death than they are in life. I think that's probably fair to say, and as a result, we need to know quicker, which is why I like to know what you were doing and what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we see that a lot. You know, I think the average estate that we see going through our platform now might have 20 to 30 assets or liabilities that need to be resolved in some way. And you just think about your own lives, you can see how that is possible now. And as you say, we're completely different financially these days as to where we used to be. And you're right that sort of we're not linear in terms of families and careers anymore. I think the average working person may well have 4 to 5 pensions, by the time they finish. As we move around more, we have workplace pensions being put in place for us, all sorts of things like that. So you can see quite easily how estates are more complicated. And what's interesting to me, and has always been interesting, is there's this common conception that the estates are complicated because of the value of those estates, and actually that's not true, right? Actually, estates are complicated by the fact of how many different places you might have that money, or indeed owe money, all of which has to be resolved. And if you think of every single one of those items in that estate requires some sort of interaction with a financial services company or something like that. And it's, again, that exchange of information that you've done 15 times already, having to tell that story over and over again. The journey that we're on is really to try and help find a way to get some industry-wide solutions that help that transition of data move far more effectively than it does today. But you can entirely see why understanding an estate at its more granular level right from the outset is so important. And one of the big, you mentioned that 1 in 3 are relying on inheritance. This is the first time, I think, where we are seeing this huge intergenerational wealth transfer, right? This is the baby boomer generation starting to hand significant amounts of money down to the next generation. And actually that's causing all sorts of interesting issues because the financial services sector is going, oh, crikey, we don't know where this money is going. And everyone's beginning to think, okay, wills, probate, estate planning, these kind of things, these are really important tools to actually engage the next generation. And I'm interested to hear your views, and maybe others around the room as to what are you seeing more and more emphasis starting to come on estate planning as people are thinking ahead a little bit more, which is not something that the Brits are good at, to be honest.
No, they're not. And I suppose I'll respond to that, but just responding to your earlier point is to give you a lifetime example of the importance of knowing where all the assets are and gathering them together at speed. Is that we had a case probably 2 or 3 years ago now, where it was a situation where all the assets were being gathered together by, I won't name them for various reasons. There's a very well-known law firm that produced the estate accounts, and we were acting for a widow who was pursuing a claim for reasonable financial provision against this estate. And this law firm produced very nicely sort of listed out all the assets and liabilities with the net estate. And that basically provided us with the details that we could then go into a mediation. And it was a very difficult, long day mediation. Started at 8:30, didn't finish till the wee hours of the morning. But we managed to get a deal, and the deal was done, and it involved a payment. And the way in which we constructed it is that the client received the estate value, but certain things outside the estate went to the stepsons. But what happened was about 2 weeks after we'd signed off this deal and signed the agreement, we got a very sheepish email from said law firm to say that they hadn't spotted or hadn't found a £500,000 cash account that was, and it was set in Barclays. It wasn't as if it was set in some kind of Mauritius bank account. It was actually there, in Barclays, and they failed to do it. And as a result, under the terms of the deal, I had a very interesting conversation with the client, because under the terms of the deal, she received everything in the estate. And of course, that included the £500,000 that nobody knew anything about. So I explained to her that it had to be, we had to disclose it. We did. And she promptly moved solicitors very, very quickly afterwards. I'm not quite sure whether or not she followed up with that. And actually didn't say anything because I think she wanted to keep it. But it gives you a good idea that without this information to hand, it has a material effect on what we're doing, for sure.
And I think that's one of the key tenets of what we're pursuing at the moment, is that use of available data that's out there in the market. One of the big changes, I think, over the last 5-10 years in technology is the advent of cloud computing. Obviously, that's a well established, really mature technology now. But also the availability of consumable data and financial data in particular. And we've done some work with Experian, one of the big credit bureaus, to look at how we can use data feeds to give people quicker access to that landscaping of a financial estate, for example. It's not foolproof, it's not perfect, but it's a good start to show how you can use data sources to do some of that estate discovery work and remove some of that risk, right? So you can, you can get, and you get this through some of the estate search type firms, so they'll go and do this for you. But increasingly those data sources are made available through APIs and things, these connection points that you can plug into technology, and that allows you to start taking the power of some of those data to remove the risk from this process. So the aim of all of us should be to try and find ways to decrease the chances that somebody would miss something, particularly when it's something in a it's not like it's a niche asset you're describing there. It's a fairly standard asset type that we should be able to identify far earlier. And that's a journey, I think, that the whole sector is on, which is nowhere near completion yet. And before you even get into talk about open banking and open finance and how all these things, I think, can play a really important role in the future. But actually, we should all be thinking about how we can start to connect data sources together better to help practitioners to remove that risk and actually relieve some of the burden off your executor or your next of kin, who's saying, actually, I'm taking on all this responsibility, which was a terrifying thing for us. When we became executors in a estate, it was only then that you realize the personal liability that you take on in that role, which I don't think many people really understand until they're deeply into it. So that's a good example of where technology can actually start to make life easier for people. And it's not just about the service, it's about de-risking things for the future, removing some of that rework and taking some of these surprises out. But it's a there's no silver bullet, unfortunately, but the world is moving in that direction. More of this stuff is becoming available, and if you can jump on the bandwagon early and start to show demand for data, that's a really big collaborative exercise for the sector, right? To say, actually, this is the type of information that we would like to see, and then people like us and others like us can go and say, well, how do we broker that? How do we find that information for you? So it's really interesting that there's a great example of.
I think it has to be that way, Nick, and I think I'd be interested to see what you think about how you take that in depth, because I can see that journey path that is being taken, and it's a no-brainer for me. Is that the more you can get information that's accurate and quick, the better it becomes for everybody concerned. Is whether that we can harness that somehow and bring it almost into life, because I don't know whether at 52, having done it a long time, my focus is leaving a little bit of legacy. We're as a law firm, we're very, very busy doing what we do it well, but I'd really like to see the number of claims coming down, really try and look back and think, actually, what did we do to try and prevent these families going through it in the first place? We can't stop the windfalls going through, which is happening. 2 out of 3 people have no will. So there's a definite disconnect between the amount of wealth that's passing down to the actual, I suppose, awareness and willingness for individuals to actually take steps to plan for their own death. And I've seen, I'm sure you have over the last 10 or 15 years, different ways in which people have tried to get that message across, whether it's increasing awareness, whether it's a knowledge sort of gap that needs to be done. Do we approach it seriously? Do we try and scare individuals into doing something about their estates in life, because if they don't, this will happen? Or do you approach it in a little bit more direct, irreverent, kind of jokey fashion? You can see some of the more sort of more modern firms are they're not dumbing down, but they're actually making it more gently. There's cartoon images. You can look around the website and you can see how we're approaching death in a different way. But I'm wondering whether or not I in a little bit like COVID did for Zoom, is that COVID for me is we set up the law firm completely paperless, was using Zoom even before the pandemic started. So it wasn't new to us, but we were definitely considered to be a little bit odd, and people didn't understand why you could possibly see clients without physically seeing them. And that of course changed because they were forced to do it. I'm hoping that kind of the way in which death is dealt with and finances and the opening up of that data can somehow be harnessed and bringing it into life, if that makes sense, to try and encourage people to, and make it easier for people to actually take steps to do estate planning. Because I hand on heart, I can say that probably 50% of the cases that we deal with, and we've had well over 3,000 in the last 5 years, would probably not happen if there'd have been proper estate planning in place, a proper will, a proper life insurance, putting that in and actually having conversations. Because if you've got blended families, then you need to have that conversation somehow. And And we've tried it different ways. I've set up through Matrona, we set up a business called Frisk, which was family risk. And the idea behind that was to sort of take information from an individual. So you drop on the website, it was free, because I think that's absolutely important, is that we make the barrier as cheap as possible and as easy as possible. And what that did is it took information from an individual about their familial kind of setup, and then it took information about their financial setup. And then it took that information, and bear in mind what we know at the sharp end of disputes is that we then produced a report that effectively said, and no holds barred, is this is you if you'd have died yesterday. This is where all your money would have gone for. This is who's in, this is who's out, this is how much tax you're going to pay. This is the problem if you've lost capacity. And it was a real kind of sort of, you know, almost like an audit of your life. And here it is. And yet even still, it's been quite difficult to get people to engage in that process. And I think it summed it up to me really. And we did a couple of marketing campaigns through some of the big tabloids, and the digital sort of engagement was higher. We did a digital engagement request where we did a piece about what happens to your children if you die, if you both died. We had a pretty poignant piece and very direct, and we got X number of hits. We then did a second article that talked about what to do. Can you overtake a hearse? And that got 3 times as many views as what should happen when it goes to. So there's a kind of way in, but I'm not sure how tech is harnessed to do that. I'll be interested to see whether or not the data platforms that you're talking about, so people engage with them in life, and that will then take you through that journey of estate planning. I think that probably will happen.
Yeah.
And I hope it does, because it needs to.
So Vicky's asked us a really good question, which is, have either of us done all this work for ourselves? So Vicky, I'll give you my view. I was in Martin's position there of pre-death planning makes far easier post-death execution is absolutely right. And one of the things I found quite interesting is a few years ago, my sister and I put in place powers of attorney for my mum and dad. They're still fine and okay, but we put that in place for them, or they put that in place when we were part of that process. So we did powers of attorney for my folks. I still have not done powers of attorney for my own family, which is ridiculous, right? We need to go to do that. We have a will. That will probably needs to be updated because my eldest daughter's 18 now. She's about to go off to uni, so life is changing. So there's a refresh of that process. But I still don't have all my own stuff in a space where I would consider it to be centralized and that's accessible to other people. And I'm on my own journey, frankly, with getting comfortable as a family. And I mean, including my parents and my wife's dad. She only has her dad left now. We lost her mum a while back. To go and have a conversation about death and money, right? It's the two things that as Brits generally we're really, really bad at, right? It's just not culturally something that we're really comfortable talking about, disclosing our own personal finances to somebody else. I'm getting to that point where you start to have those conversations, but actually if there was a professional helping us through that process, it becomes a little bit easier to do because you're asking, someone else is prompting the questions. And what was a real shock to me was when we put in place the powers of attorney, the solicitor and indeed the financial advisor who were working with my folks to put this stuff in place, neither of them reached out to me to say, hey, Nick, have you thought about this? Let's talk about what would happen, right? In the event that you have to use this power of attorney, what would you do? Do you know enough about your parents' financials to actually figure out how you'd pay for care, or what you would, you need to sell their house? What would you do? That conversation has never happened. And we need to go and do that. But I think it's a really big shift that we make advice more available to normal people who need this kind of help, and actually putting in place wills and powers of attorney, which have been dismissed as dull and boring, are really essential. We need to get back to that. So the long answer, Vicky, to your short question is I'm not as good as I should be, and we're actively going through that process now. My dad ended up in hospital a month ago. He's out and he's okay, but that really sharpened the focus on, actually, if something had happened to him, would I be able to help my mum through this process? So I think Martin's point on digital engagement, actually, it's probably our generation that needs to be engaged and helping our parents and the people who are in that position now through this process get these things in place. You need to almost step down a generation and engage and explain it, because I think the baby boomers, they're quite set in their ways. They've got this far. They're into retirement, late retirement. They're not going. Engaging them now is potentially quite tricky. So getting advisors and legal professionals involved with the next generation and finding a way to talk to them about, you know, these kind of challenges, I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think so far as in response to your question, Vicky, my view is that I've done as much as I can do. I'm classically blended family, so I've got my eldest son is from my first marriage. My other 3 children are from my marriage now, and I felt like I was on top of it. You know, you'd expect that for the type of work that I did. But a discussion only a couple of weeks ago, actually, we realised, and children have this nasty habit of growing up, is that they're all now over 18, bar one. So suddenly I'm now facing, well, actually, I need to deal with this slightly different, because they've got partners there that are starting to arrive, and how do we deal with that, and do we have to create all those kind of discussions. And that's, yeah. And at the moment, law and law firms are still felt very often as a little bit too staid to approach sometimes, and particularly sitting in front of somebody you don't know, and actually speaking about really intimate things about your family and what your wishes are, and the rest of it is sometimes seems daunting.
Yeah.
But I do think that this is why financial advisors they're all talking to. So I think going forward, the whole IFA sort of circuit is where it's going to be at. I think you talk about platforms coming full circle all the way back to them, because they have a reason to meet and see every year. Whereas what I do is a distress service. What most lawyers do is transactional. They don't have that relationship that you just described very often. Yeah. The better ones do, but there's not many.
And Vicky, your point about printed stuff, the paper file, you know, the folder on the top on the top shelf is really important. But I also think there's a slight tendency, and I'm not talking to you here, it's generally, and I certainly saw this in the financial world as well, is that we assume that the silver surfer generation don't do digital. Right? And actually, they're called the silver surfers for a reason, because increasingly a lot of them are very comfortable using digital tools, but what they still really value is human intervention and the ability to go and speak to someone about stuff that's important. I spent a chunk of time in the kind of investment space in financial services, and there's this crazy obsession with robo advice, where you know you be able to deal with everybody's challenges through 5 questions and put them in an investment product. And Steve, I think it was Steve who just, let me get the chat up. I can see that. Yeah, Steve Pett. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Only the well-off get financial advice, right? And the answer to advice is a 5-question robo advice model, which is complete nonsense, right? It's of no use to anybody. If you're lucky enough to have 30 grand kicking about that you can afford to go and invest in something, that's great. But the majority of people, 30 grand is a significant chunk of their money, and you need access to advice. And that's the holy grail, I think, of the financial services world, which is becoming increasingly commoditized, is actually being able to access advice and relationships. That's the important bit. And I think you collectively as practitioners have a really interesting role to play in that, in making it advice available, because it's the banks who are trying to chase advice, and most people view banks in a very different way to how banks think of people view them, right? Which is, you're my current account holder. I don't value the relationship with you particularly. So the financial services sector, the top end financial services sector, rushing in to mid-market mass retail advice, I think it doesn't really work for me. But actually, I think if you can, as legal services professionals and advisors, professional advisors, going out and finding ways to make this cost effective for people and profitable for yourself, you need to run businesses. I do think that's a really interesting space, and using digital technology to enable it is absolutely the right way to go. Assuming that digital technology can be the answer to advice, I think is a fallacy. But that's the big thing, Steve, is to try and help people who typically wouldn't have had access to advice to do it. And actually, think some of these tools, you're putting in place wills, powers of attorney, engaging in a generational conversation, that can be done reasonably efficiently, and it's a good start, right? It's a good start. It gives you the basis to then go back and have other conversations in the future. And our view is, if you can plug pre-death planning toolkit to our kind of stuff we're building post-death, you can make that transition much more seamless, and you know who's involved, you know who all the people are, you know where all the money is, you know what the plans are. That should help resolve some of those dispute issues that Martin's talked about. But it's a journey. There's no silver bullet, one thing that solves it all yet. But you've got to get on and start adopting some of these pieces of technology, inserting them into the way that you work, and over time they will evolve and iterate to your needs and demands, right? It's an interesting learning for me about the legal services world. Is you rightly, and I do understand this, you worry about the edge cases, right? You worry about, because the edge cases is where the risk is, and actually adopting technology, the starting point often is, does it cater for all these edge cases? And the answer to that invariably for new technologies, well, it doesn't yet, but if you can get on board and start the feedback loop, those edge cases will be catered for over time. But that's the kind of challenge in modern software adoption, is it doesn't answer everything all at once from day one. You need to work with it and use it, and good service providers will give you the opportunity to feed in and respond to that, and eventually those edge cases get managed out.
And I think they join up as well, don't they? Because if you get individual parts, someone finds an answer for a particular thing, then they start to join up, and once you've joined up, it works. And we've kind of split our tech development into two, really: the life side and the death side. So the life side is all about knowledge and awareness and increasing the incidence of people making estate planning, but also creating some software that some people laugh that we set up just to try and preserve the wills that are actually made. So if you've only got 1/3 of people making wills, let's try and make them as robust as we can so that they properly reflect and they'll stand up. So we've introduced software to try and back up the challenges, and rewinding it, knowing what we know at the sharp end is take that information, go back to the beginning and make sure that the will makers are recording and getting all the information they need in place to answer any challenge that might come 7-8 years later, which tends to be the average time between will and death. And then on the death side, what we try to do is pick discrete bits, just following up what you were saying. There is no one bit of tech or software or even a solution actually that can solve probate disputes, because they're quite complex in nature and in terms of fact and law. But what we can do is pick the sharp end bit, the bits that feel like we don't really need a lawyer, or they're too expensive to get involved. And one of them was disputes, just something simple. It's dispute about chattels. So very often we come up against cases where we've kind of got a settlement sorted, but there is 50, 60 items in the house, and you've got 4 or 5 siblings, and we're all arguing about who should have what. They're all having equal shares, but do you value it on second-hand value, or is it sentimental value, or is it? And you can imagine, and this is why it always comes to the end. You've almost got a deal, and then suddenly someone raises the spectre of chattels. And I've been in courts when this has happened, and judges have essentially told the parties to leave the room. You've got 1 hour. If you don't come back with an agreement, I'm going to order it all be sold, and we'll split the proceeds 5 ways. That's how fed up they get with the time involved in it. And if you've got lawyers of both ends who are very aware that at £250 an hour each, that's £500 for every hour arguing about TV.
Yeah.
You argue about that for 2 hours, you could have had two brand new TVs, you could have one each. I'm being facetious, but it nevertheless is a problem. So what we did there is that we've got a perceived fairness algorithm that a maths professor put together, which essentially just resolve the problem. The idea is you plug in the items, they all then go through a process of bidding. The mathematical algorithm is applied, and it produces a result where there is a perceived fairness as opposed to just simply who bidded the most for each one. And the response has been amazing. It's incredible. Is that actually each and every time the beneficiaries on the test runs also, yeah, okay, we think that's fair. So it's just an example of finding a bit of software and tech that actually solves an individual problem. And what I'd like to see is someone picks that up and says, well, actually, we could use that kind of idea of 2 parameters, items and people fighting. We can take that and we can fit it into something else that actually will work. And that's how I see it progressing over time, is that things will start, and then suddenly it works with some Exident software, or it works with somebody else's software, and And that's how it begins to extend, isn't it? Is these little pockets of someone's had a go to try and resolve it.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do something about it, it'll be the same problem going on forever.
That's right. And typically, you're right. The solution to a good set of or technology is a bunch of integrated things that can talk to each other, and that's a really important characteristic of modern software. Is, you know, you're going to find things that need to have conversations with each other effectively, and that work to integrate stuff is quite daunting. Actually, it's quite an undertaking to think about, well, how do you take those 6 pieces of the jigsaw and connect them together? And you need to be able to rely on your software providers to be smart enough to be able to go and say, oh, we can connect there, but doing it on a standardized basis, not point-to-point connections, because they inevitably go stale and it's hard to maintain those things. So finding standardized software that can talk to each other, that's a really big part. And you see some of that with the practice management systems. They're increasingly app store style models where you're connecting stuff together, which is definitely the way to go. Joe, your point around just going back on the digital vault question, that perception that putting all your information in one place is a risk is definitely true. There's no doubt about that. So I worked at Barclays for 9 years. I spent 18 months at Barclays looking at how to look at financial advice and that kind of space. I have a reasonable amount of experience with this. And one of the biggest challenges, even with the big blue eagle behind you, with customers who are already giving, you know, they've already got identity with a bank, they're already using it digitally. You put the concept of a digital vault where you put all your information in, and there's a lot of it was, oh no, I don't fancy that. There's too much risk. What happens if someone gets into it? What happens if it gets hacked? What happens if, you know, someone comes and steals all my information? Or indeed, yeah, I don't necessarily want my next generation to see where all the money is, or indeed my other half to see where all the money is. So there's some really interesting behavioral stuff in that space, and I think that's why a lot of the startup ecosystem around digital vaults and all these kind of things is a bit of a struggle, because, you know, just ask yourself, would you be happy to just give all your information to this, you know, unknown digital brand that, you know, is your most important stuff? I think that's hard, but get to a point where at least you've got access to some critical documents that help someone take, you know, the next generation through certain things. There's definitely some steps we can take to make that better. Comms and transparency, I was going to talk about that, maybe Martin, just very briefly, the role of, or how technology is helping some of those more basic interaction points as well, around how you communicate with clients, how you give them transparency on what's happening, when it's happening, some of these frustrations. Do you have a view on that? Because obviously we've all launched into online world, you know, because we had to. How do you see that panning out in the future?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable, isn't it? I think the way in which we communicate and the speed at which we communicate at is just getting faster. I mean, from personal experience, when we set up 5 years ago, we operate the firm digitally using a case management system, which was off the shelf, which we then tailored to include sort of front end. We're talking about extending and plugging in software. They developed something new at the front end that helped us communicate with our clients, which opened up a two-way conversation going through the internet, which made it a lot easier. Still communicate by email, still share files electronically. So, you know, that became the norm for us pretty quickly. And what we are finding is that the time and energy at our end is now into training our team and our lawyers into manage the speed of that process, because as you get busier, and the challenges for practice is, as communications get faster, the expectations of responses are coming back, are getting higher and higher, you know, and the temptation, and it is a training issue at the end of the day, is you can control the time limits, you can control the time periods and the response times to make that work for you. But certainly I can't imagine a situation now, certainly within 5 years, where there's letters going out, you know, is we probably post, bearing in mind we're a practice that turns over about 2,020,000 people involved, we probably send out 2 letters a day, if that, as a law firm. Who are, you know, by our own admission, our sector tends to be a little bit behind a lot of the other sectors, because I think the risk averse in every sense of that phrase,
Yeah.
so they don't do it. But we're down to that, and I don't think we're going to be unusual. I think within 5 years it will be, everybody will be at it. So
Yeah.
I think it's inevitable.
That's certainly my hope. I think some of when you talk to the client side of this equation, we've heard really interesting phrases like black holes. I just don't know what's happening. I don't have any visibility of the process. So those little small things you can do to give people a sense of where things are and what you're waiting on and all those kind of things definitely help. Because if you're a bereaved individual, it's a bit like sunburn, right? You're more sensitive to everything because you're going through a really emotionally difficult time. And what would just be an irritant to you normally is extremely frustrating and can get to build anxiety quite quickly if you're not clear on what's happening when. So that area is really interesting to me, how you improve.
Yeah, I think expectation management next at the front end. That's where some of our focus is at the moment. Is that we get, for every 10 inquiries we get coming in, and they can come in from all kinds of sources. It can be directly to email, or it can be phone calls, or very often referred by people. Is 8 out of 10 of those inquiries are not matters that actually turn into contentious probate cases that we take on. We get sent all kinds of stuff, all kinds of problems, any issue in relation to the administration of the estate. Something as simple as, I can't find a will, where do you think I should look? And you're on the end of a phone sort of saying, well, have you tried the study? Have you tried doing a search with certainty? Have you tried those kind of things? So what we are finding is that we at the front end can use tech to not go down the bot route, but actually still have that personal phone call, but immediately there is then information that we can fire out to them that not only explains why we don't need to be doing anything, but explaining what their opportunities are and what choices they have, and signpost them to somewhere who can help. So that's how we've used tech at the front end, is to try and get that system going out. And from a business point of view, that reduces the amount of time within the firm being spent on this 80% of the cases. But from the inquirer's point of view, we're giving them maximum amount of information they need to try and resolve their issues, and that keeps the referrers happy, keeps them happy. We feel better because we want to help. We want to help everybody that calls, and that's how we've used it, almost like a triage front end. And I can imagine that will become a little bit more sophisticated as we go through it. But at the moment, that's where it's expectations that we're dealing with it.
And I heard this phrase. I was on an SRA Innovate event the other day, and I heard this phrase unbundling, where actually you're breaking the service apart a little bit, and you're putting more onus back on to your client to do some activity, and really you're focusing on the almost like the pay-as-you-go advice. As you need it, you're paying for that, you're paying for that, you're paying for that. Do you see that happening more and more, that the technology allows you to maybe allow or give the client a bit more control and say, well, I'll deal with this bit because I can, and I'm not relying on you to do admin for me. I can do some of these bits. Is that a concept that you, or in fact anyone else on the call, are you starting to see that becoming more of a thing?
Yeah, I mean, our starting position is we're probably more transparent than most, is that we break down any particular problem dispute into particular phases. So we'll break it down into phases and then give minimum and maximum fee estimates for the phases. So we're actually doing it with clients saying, okay, phase 1's fine, we'll stop, take a breath, and then decide if we're going to do phase 2 going forward. Whether somebody could come in and say, can you just do phase 2? I'll do phase 1 and I'll do phase 3. Yes, that could happen. In terms of tech, have we introduced that? Not yet. I could see it happening. I mean, there's a service called Robot Lisa, which if you look that up, is an NDA, so a non-disclosure agreement production sort of vehicle, and there's a software, it's free. So what they do is that they produce, if you want to have a conversation, you don't want to disclose anything about that discussion with anybody else, you can get them online. Both go through that entire process. You're paying for a single bit of that process, and then the lawyers, if you want them, can then plug in and provide you some more sort of rounded advice or bigger advice. But they've honed it right down to that free service, and I see that happening more. Somebody once described it as, you no longer pay for the chocolate, you're paying for the wrap around the outside type of thing, and I think that probably is true. I think you will find that unbundling for lawyers is almost an anathema. I think this is why they're resistant to it, because they take the view that I am transactionally trained. I'm trained here to get you from a start position to an end position. So I struggle with the idea, this is a general comment, of actually just picking one of those elements of the journey. But I'm pretty sure if the front end becomes slicker using IT, using tech, I then take that information, give you the answer, and you take it back, you finish it off, then I can see how that would work.
Okay, all right. Another question, I'm sorry if I get this name wrong, I think, is it Aidan?
I'd go with Aidan, yeah.
Do you currently provide indemnities for the wills and estate admin sector? Aidan, who's that directed at, just so we can answer that properly? You can either take yourself off mute or stick it in the chat. So this is a general market question, I guess. Do you have Martin, any perspective on this?
Well, I think there are insurance companies out there that will provide insurance for all kinds of facets of the administration process. It's a little bit like, and I think it will increase in incidents, because you've only got to look back at the way in which conveyancing went. You know, back in the day, I'm old enough to remember Tipex in the office, so I do remember when lawyers were typing out their big conveyancing on massive pieces of paper, and that got replaced. All these investigations into title and the rest all got replaced by insurance, because it was quicker, it was slicker, it was cheaper. And actually the insurance market twigged that the incidence of risk and problems was very low. So therefore the claims history became quite positive. So they got involved. There is that happening now in respect to the wills and estate admin sector, is that you can get insurance, for example, for missing beneficiaries. You can get insurance for even for claims coming in, and we work quite closely with a company called Dual, who have in the past produced very bespoke insurance policies for us. So we've had disputes where we've settled a claim on behalf of 3 potential claimants coming in, and the 4th claimant wasn't aware, didn't know, but could bring a claim later, and they provide an insurance policy to cover that particular risk that worked quite well. So it's a very active side of our market, and I see that increasing. I've been approached by 2 insurance companies asking me to get involved in producing some kind of insurance to cover costs that flow from a dispute if a will is challenged. You know, so they are beginning to look ahead as to how we can actually get involved in this particular market, because again, where there's claims going up, there's insurers that are interested in covering that kind of risk, aren't they? So yes, in short, we don't provide it because we're not insurance companies, but there are people out there who will.
Yeah, fantastic. So listen, it's at 11:57 according to my clock. Are there any other questions from the group that you want to pose? Either pose it and we can answer it offline, or not. You'll have our email addresses anyway, so if you want to reach out to either Martin or I, and you have questions about either IDR or Exozent and what we're trying to do, we'd be delighted to hear from you. So I'll let that percolate a little bit, but I just want to say thanks to everyone for attending. We weren't quite sure how this would go. It's a new format for both Martin and I, just chatting away and seeing if we can stimulate some thoughts and conversations. So hopefully it was nice to listen to something and not just have to stare at slides for an hour. We'd both be delighted to field any other questions that you have, either on the services that Exozent provides as a estate administration piece of software that is still on its own journey, but we're making some good headway, and so big plans for the future about how we connect things together. And I'm sure, Martin, you'd be happy to chat about IDR and the network and everything else you've got going there.
Yeah, absolutely. More than happy to do that, both on this or separately. We've got something called an IDRN, which is a network which we've launched fairly recently, that's just aimed at anybody working in the wills and probate sector. If you go on the website, you'll see there's a link into it. It's completely free to join, and there's just loads of information there, both anecdotally talking about things like sibling rivalry, or this information on intestacy, or it's all in there and it's all free to use. And then there's some links, and if you've got clients or problems, you can send those through too as well. So I'm happy to do any of that. So
Martin, I'm going to stick my email address in the chat. If you want to do the same, just so people have it. If you do have, well, that should be .com. There's your first fatal error. x.com, not comma.com. You get the gist. So if those of you have any other follow-up questions, please do get in touch. We're delighted to chat more. If you liked it, please do let us know, and we're happy to do these kind of things before we, again, I should say, find some other topics to talk about. But for now, enjoy Thursday, enjoy the rest of the week. And if you haven't had your summer holidays already, hope that flights all go according to plan and everyone manages to get away and have some sure well-deserved time off. So thanks,
Thanks, everybody.
all right, cheers all.
Bye-bye.